Three very creepy old bedroom horror stories. The house stood at the edge of a forgotten town, isolated and looming like a warning. Celine felt its pull immediately, though she didn't quite understand why. The locals had warned her to stay away. Their whispers were full of unease, but she shrugged them off. She needed a retreat, and the Turner estate seemed perfect, quiet, secluded, and shrouded in the kind of history she could only dream of. As she drove up the winding driveway, an eerie silence wrapped around her. The towering oaks seemed to watch her every move, their branches stretched like skeletal hands. The house was massive, its windows dark and hollow, as if they were eyes staring back at her. Stepping out of her car, she froze for a moment. There was something. The air felt heavy, like a storm was brewing, yet the skies were clear. She shook off the feeling and grabbed her bags. Inside, the house was just as she imagined. Dust coated every surface, and the air carried a faint, musty smell. Every step she took on the creaky floorboards seemed amplified, as if the house were echoing her arrival. She wandered from room to room, her curiosity outweighing her unease. The old furniture and faded wallpaper hinted at a life long forgotten. But then, she found it. The door at the end of the hallway. It was different. Strange. Unlike the others, its surface was carved with intricate patterns that seemed to move when she tilted her head. She gripped the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Locked. Her chest tightened, though she couldn't say why. It was just a door, wasn't it? That night, the silence of the house was oppressive. At first, it was peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos of the city she'd left behind. But as the hours dragged on, it became unbearable. The creaks and groans of the old house were more than just the settling of wood. They felt deliberate, intentional. When she finally climbed into bed, the quiet was so heavy it pressed against her ears. And then, in the dead of night, she heard it. A scraping sound. Soft, deliberate, and near. Her breath caught as she strained to listen. At first, she told herself it was just her imagination. The house was old. It was bound to make noise. But when the sound moved, dragging closer, her heart began to race. "Who's there?" she whispered into the dark, her voice trembling. No answer. The next morning, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The walls seemed closer. The shadows in the corners felt heavier. Her eyes kept darting back to the locked door at the end of the hall. She couldn't ignore it anymore. Determined, she spent the morning searching the house. Finally, she found the key, a small brass thing, tarnished with age, tucked away in a drawer. Standing before the door, she hesitated. The air seemed colder here, and her hand trembled as she inserted the key. Click. The door creaked open, revealing a bedroom that hadn't been touched in decades. Dust hung in the air like a veil. The furniture, an old bed, a cracked mirror, a weathered nightstand, seemed frozen in time. But the cold was what struck her most. It wasn't natural. Her eyes landed on a small, leather-bound journal sitting on the nightstand. Her heart thudded in her chest as she picked it up. The journal belonged to someone named Eleanor. The entries began innocently enough, musings about the weather, visitors, and the monotony of life. But as Celine read on, the tone shifted. Eleanor wrote of whispers at night, of shadows that moved when no one was there. One passage made Celine's stomach drop. "This room is alive. It takes the sound, the light, and soon it will take me." She slammed the journal shut, her hands shaking. Suddenly, she felt it. A presence. The air in the room grew colder, so cold that her breath misted in the dim light. She bolted, locking the door behind her. That night the whispers began. At first they were faint, a murmur that could almost be dismissed as wind. But they grew louder. They weren't just sounds. They were voices, clear, deliberate, and near. She sat up in bed, her heart hammering in her chest. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice cracking. The whispers stopped. For a moment, the silence was worse than the sound. And then, the scraping began. Closer, louder, more deliberate. Her lamp flickered, casting shadows that twisted and stretched across the room. She swore they were moving, reaching for her. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Celine decided to leave. She threw her belongings into her suitcase, her hands trembling, but when she reached the front door, it wouldn't open. The lock turned, but the door wouldn't budge. "No, no, no," she whispered, panic creeping into her voice. She tried the windows, sealed shut. The house. It wouldn't let her go. Her only option was the locked bedroom. She stepped inside, the journal still sitting on the nightstand. The room felt alive. The shadows writhed, darker and more oppressive than before. And then she saw it, a figure. Emerging from the corner, its form was dark and shifting, its presence more felt than seen. It didn't move toward her, but its voice cut through the cold air. "This is my home," it said, its tone low and guttural. "You do not belong." Celine stumbled back, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. The figure grew, its shadow engulfing the room. She fled, slamming the door behind her. The house groaned, the walls closing in as if the building itself was alive. She ran, her breath ragged, her mind screaming at her to get out. When she reached the front door, it finally gave way. She didn't look back as she drove away, the headlights piercing the darkness of the woods. But the house wasn't done with her. Late at night, when the world was quiet, Celine still heard the whispers. They followed her. And no matter how far she ran, she couldn't escape the feeling that the house was waiting for her to return. This is Most Scariest Old Bedroom Horror Story number 2. The air was sharp and biting as Myrna stepped out of her car. Her breath formed small clouds in the darkness, and she stood still for a moment, staring up at the house she had tried to forget. It loomed before her like a shadow of her past, familiar yet strange. The skeletal trees surrounding it creaked in the wind, their bare branches clawing at the sky. Myrna swallowed hard, clutching the keys in her trembling hand. Why did she have to come back here? The heavy front door groaned in protest as she pushed it open. A rush of stale, musty air hit her face, and she coughed. The house smelled like time, thick and unmoving. The dim glow of her flashlight swept across the walls, revealing faded floral wallpaper that seemed to sag under the weight of years. The silence was deafening. Her footsteps echoed with every hesitant step she took, making her feel painfully aware of just how alone she was. But was she really alone? Myrna tried to shake off the thought, but a chill ran down her spine. Her eyes darted toward the staircase, its wooden steps creaking softly, as if someone had just stepped on them. She froze. Her heart pounded so hard it echoed in her ears. "It's just the house settling," she whispered to herself, her voice shaky. But even as she said it, she didn't believe it. Her grandmother's house had always felt strange, especially the room at the end of the upstairs hallway, the one that had always been locked, the one she was told to stay away from. She had never questioned it. Until now. As she ascended the stairs, each step felt heavier than the last. The hallway stretched before her, dim and endless. Her flashlight flickered, and she stopped dead in her tracks. "Come on." "Not now," she muttered, shaking it desperately. The beam steadied, and she let out a shaky breath, but then she heard it. A whisper. It was faint, almost too soft to hear, but it sent an icy shiver down her back. She turned toward the sound, her flashlight trembling in her grip. The door to the forbidden room. It was slightly ajar. Her stomach dropped. It had always been locked, always. She stepped closer, her breaths shallow and quick. The carved patterns on the door seemed to writhe in the flickering light, like twisting vines coming to life. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling. "It's just a room," she whispered. "Just a room." But as she pushed the door open, the air grew heavy, oppressive. Inside, the room was eerily pristine. The canopy bed was draped in delicate lace, untouched by time. The wardrobe loomed in the corner, its dark wood gleaming. An antique mirror leaned against the wall, its surface clouded and murky. And then she saw it, a photograph on the nightstand. Her grandmother smiled in the picture, youthful and vibrant, standing next to a man Myrna didn't recognize. But there was something off about him. His eyes seemed too dark, his smile too forced. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing the frame. The man's face seemed to shift under her gaze, his expression darkening. Myrna's heart raced as she placed the photo back on the nightstand, her hands trembling. A sudden creak made her spin around, the wardrobe. Its door was slightly open now, though she was sure it had been closed. Myrna ... She gasped, stumbling backward. The voice was low, guttural, and far too close. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The air grew colder, and the whisper came again, this time louder. "Leave." Her chest tightened as she backed away. The mirror fogged over, and her breath hitched as words began to scrawl across its surface as though written by an unseen hand. "Help me!" Myrna's knees nearly buckled. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she turned toward the wardrobe. Shadows shifted inside, darker than the room itself. A figure emerged, its form fluid and undefined, like smoke given shape. "You shouldn't have opened the door," it growled, its voice vibrating through the room. Myrna couldn't breathe. Her legs refused to move as the shadow crept closer, its presence suffocating. And then the music started, software haunting. She turned toward the nightstand, where a small music box now sat, playing a distorted lullaby she hadn't heard since childhood. Her grandmother's lullaby. The shadow recoiled slightly, its shape flickering. Myrna didn't hesitate. She grabbed the music box, clutching it tightly. The mirror cleared, revealing her grandmother's reflection. "Grandma?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Her grandmother's reflection nodded, her face filled with sorrow. "I told you, Myrna. Some doors should never be opened." "What do I do?" Myrna's voice cracked, desperation spilling over. "You have to send it away. Destroy the photograph. Destroy the music box." The shadow lunged forward, its roar shaking the walls. Myrna screamed, throwing the music box against the wall. The melody stopped abruptly as it shattered into pieces. The shadow writhed, its form unraveling as if pulled apart by unseen hands. The photograph burst into flames on the nightstand, the man's face twisting in agony before disappearing. The room fell silent. Myrna stumbled backward, her legs barely able to carry her. The door creaked open and she bolted, her heart racing as she fled down the stairs and out of the house. The cold night air hit her like a slap, and she didn't stop running until she reached her car. She fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking, and finally drove away. But as she glanced in the rearview mirror, her breath caught. In the upstairs window, a shadow moved, watching, waiting. This is most creepy old bedroom horror story number 3. Althea had always dreamed of escaping, of finding peace, something quiet, something far from the chaos. That's why when she stumbled upon the old house on the outskirts of her grandmother's village, she couldn't resist. The price seemed unreal, almost too good to be true. But she was swept up in the idea of starting fresh, of making this house hers. Her heart raced with excitement as she imagined setting up her new life. Little did she know that house, that sweet little cottage, was about to pull her into something she couldn't escape. It was a quiet, cool afternoon when Althea first saw the upstairs. She'd been hearing strange noises for days, the floorboards creaking, the faint sound of something scraping like a scratch on the walls. She told herself it was the house settling. Houses did that, right? But curiosity crept in, and she couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling gnawing at her. Upstairs she found 2 doors, one opened to a small, dusty guest room, unused and still. But the other, that door, it was locked. She didn't think much of it at first. She shrugged, figuring she'd find the key or break it open later. But that night the sounds returned. They were worse, more pronounced, scratching, scraping, like something was trying to get out. It started faintly, almost like whispers, but it grew louder with every passing minute. Althea tried to ignore it, pulling the covers over her head and convincing herself that it was nothing more than the house settling. Right? But the scratching didn't stop. It never stopped. The next day, Althea's unease intensified. She rummaged through drawers and closets, searching for something, anything, that could explain the strange sounds, and that's when she found it. A small, ornate key tucked away in an old jewelry box. It was so small, delicate, like it had been waiting for her. That night, Althea couldn't resist. She unlocked the door and stepped into the room. The air was cold, thick with the weight of something ancient. Dust filled the corners of the room, and the stale scent of age hit her as soon as she crossed the threshold. The bed was small, its iron frame darkened with time. The walls were covered in faded floral wallpaper, peeling at the edges. But what caught her attention the most was the painting hanging on the wall above the bed, a portrait of a woman. Her face was soft, serene even, but her eyes, those eyes, something about them was wrong. They felt too alive, too watchful, as if they were waiting, following her every move. Althea froze. Her heartbeat quickened, and her breath caught in her throat. But she shook her head, trying to push the unease away. It was just an old painting. It was just her imagination. But when she closed the door behind her and locked it again, the feeling lingered. Something felt off, but she couldn't put her finger on it. That night, the scratching returned, louder, more frantic. It was as though something or someone was trying to claw its way through the walls. Althea clenched her fists, fighting the rising panic. "It's nothing," she told herself. "It's nothing." But her heart pounded, each beat echoing in the silence of the room. Sleep was impossible. The sounds didn't stop. The next day, Althea told herself she was just imagining things. But when the sun set and the night returned, the scratching didn't just start again, it escalated. The scraping grew faster, closer. Althea found herself standing in the hallway, heart in her throat, staring at the door to the locked room. Was it just the house settling? Or was it something else? She found the key in the jewelry box. She couldn't help herself. This time, when she unlocked the door, it creaked open with an agonizing slowness. The room was darker than before, colder. The wallpaper had peeled even more, revealing patches of bare wood, and the painting. The woman's expression had changed. Her once serene face was now twisted, her eyes wide, filled with terror. Althea's pulse raced as she stepped back, her breath shallow, her legs trembling. The air thickened, her chest tightened. It felt like the room itself was closing in around her. The walls seemed to shift, the corners darkening, and her mind raced. And then, from somewhere deep within the walls, there came a sound, footsteps heavy and deliberate. Slow, so slow. Althea's heart nearly stopped. The scratching, the footsteps, they grew louder, closer. Someone was moving in the walls. She could feel it, could hear it. It was getting closer. Althea spun around, desperate to get out. But as she reached for the door, something stopped her. The door. It was closing. On its own. She couldn't move. Her body felt frozen in place, like she was trapped in some kind of nightmare, her breath caught in her throat. She reached for the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. The room seemed to close in on her. And then she saw it. The painting. The woman in the portrait was no longer calm, no longer serene. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, her eyes wide in absolute terror. She was reaching out to Althea. Something shifted in the room. Shadows flickered, moving toward her. Althea tried to scream, but the sound was trapped inside her throat, choked by fear. The door slammed open, and Althea bolted. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The footsteps, so heavy, so close, were following her. The cold was everywhere. Her lungs burned, her feet stumbled, but she didn't stop running. Not until she was outside, gasping for air, the night cold against her skin. She ran and ran. Althea didn't return to the house that night. She didn't sleep. The fear held her in its grip, keeping her awake, making her wonder what was in that room. What had she unlocked? The next morning, she returned to the house. But when she reached the room upstairs, everything was gone. The bed, the wallpaper, the painting, all vanished. It was as though they had never been there. The room was empty. bare. Althea couldn't explain it. How could she? The painting had been so real, so vivid. The fear that had gripped her in that room, it hadn't been her imagination. It couldn't have been. She left that day, never returning to the house. And though time passed and her mind tried to forget, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, waiting, watching. Althea often wondered when she closed her eyes at night if she could still hear the footsteps behind her, slow and steady, drawing nearer.